2 summers before the Great Drought of 1886, a man named Samuel Colquhoun died on the prairie of Drybone Flats, Kansas Territory, trying to dig a well. He was not struck by lightning or attacked by wolves or thrown from a horse. He simply worked, digging deeper into the earth, searching for water, and the heat took him. The temperature that day was 118 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer couldn't read higher. By midday, his lips had cracked and bled. By afternoon, he had collapsed near the hole he'd been excavating. By evening, he was dead, his body still warm from the sun's punishment. His widow, Nettie Colquhoun, was 23 years old and alone with a question that would consume the next 14 months of her life. The question was simple. If there was no water 40 feet down, the depth Samuel had reached before the heat claimed him, then how deep would she have to go to find it? How far beneath the summer sun's reach would she have to descend to find water that would not run dry, that would not depend on rain or shallow wells that failed in drought, that would exist in the perpetual cold far beneath the parched surface? The townspeople of Drybone Flats thought she was mad. They said grief had taken her reason. They said a woman, alone, working a pick and shovel in the heat, was a widow lost to obsession rather than a woman seeking survival. They called her names: the mole, the gravedigger, and they whispered that she would indeed find a grave, and likely her own. The preacher, Reverend Mitchell, gave a sermon about the dangers of a woman operating beyond her proper sphere. He warned from the pulpit that Nettie's digging was an affront to the natural order and that the earth itself would punish her pride. His words crystallized the town's judgment. It was not merely that her work was foolish, it was that her work was unseemly, immoral. A woman wielding tools, making engineering decisions, solving problems that men had failed to solve. This was a transgression that demanded community condemnation. But Nettie Colquhoun did not listen to their judgment. She listened instead to what she had learned in her year of marriage to Samuel, to the conversations they'd had about water in this merciless land, to the books about geology and underground aquifers that she'd studied in the dark by candlelight while her husband slept. And she began to dig. She began in June of 1884, 14 months after Samuel's death. She recruited help from Ezra Whitmore, the town blacksmith, a quiet man who had lost his own son to dehydration and who saw in Nettie's work a chance at redemption. Ezra never spoke publicly in her defense. That would have endangered his standing in the town, but he brought her tools at night, leaving them on her property without words or explanation. He contributed small amounts of money when she needed supplies. He worked alongside her in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. She borrowed his picks and shovels, studied water tables in the borrowed books from the traveling minister's library, and she marked the depth where Samuel had dug, 40 feet, and then she kept going. In the summer heat that approached 115 degrees, with dust devils rising around her and the sun beating down on her straw hat until the inside brim was soaked with sweat, Nettie Colquhoun dug, day after day after day, alone or with Ezra's quiet help, with blisters on her hands that became calluses, with muscles that grew stronger and shoulders that broadened from the physical labor. 50 feet, 60 feet, 70 feet, the earth revealed itself to her in layers. Tan topsoil that was dry as powder. Below that, clay that grew heavier and more stubborn, requiring different techniques to excavate efficiently. Below that, layers of shale and stone that required hours of work with a pick to advance even a foot. She developed calluses upon calluses, layers of hardened skin that would have horrified the proper ladies of the town. The deeper she went, the cooler the air became. By 80 feet down, the air itself was cold, a relief so profound that she would sometimes pause just to feel the difference in temperature between the world above and the world below. The townspeople, meanwhile, organized themselves into a faction of opposition. Cyrus Dunlap, the rancher who owned the largest spread in the territory and controlled water rights through his network of shallow wells, took a particular interest in stopping her work. His fortune had been built on scarcity. In a dry land, a man who controlled water controlled everything. The prices settlers paid, the farms that failed or succeeded, the political power that flowed from holding the most precious resource. Nettie's wealth threatened to make water abundant, and abundance destroys monopoly. He came to her homestead in August and told her bluntly that what she was doing was foolish, dangerous, and a waste of resources that the town needed elsewhere. He offered to buy her land at a price that was less than half what it was worth, confident that her desperation would force acceptance. When she refused, he told her that she would never succeed, that the deep aquifer was a myth, that she would dig down 200 feet and find only more dry stone, and that her obsession would end with her death in a hole. Nettie looked at him calmly and asked him what he was afraid of. He didn't answer. But the question hung between them, because Cyrus Dunlap's entire empire was built on controlling water in a dry land. His shallow wells gave him power. His monopoly on water rights gave him wealth. A widow with a well that tapped into an inexhaustible deep aquifer threatened everything he had built. He would lose his monopoly. He would lose his power. He would become merely a rancher rather than the man who controlled the most essential resource in the territory. The realization infuriated him. By October, Nettie had reached 100 feet. The earth had changed character. The stone was harder, more crystalline. The color had shifted from rust and tan to gray and deep brown. The temperature was noticeably cool. She could see her breath sometimes when she worked early in the morning. And then, at 120 feet, she found it. Water. Not seeping slowly through dry stone, but actually flowing through the earth. Actual liquid. She marked the depth carefully. She measured it. She continued digging. By November, she had reached 150 feet, and the water was flowing more strongly. She could hear it in the stone, a sound like voices speaking in a language older than human speech. She could see moisture on the walls of her excavation, witness to the presence of the aquifer she had theorized. She could feel the change in the air, dampness, the smell of wet earth, the scent of deep places where water moved through minerals and limestone, where the surface world's heat had no dominion. The town's skepticism had begun to shift, but not toward belief. Instead, it shifted toward concern. If she was actually finding water, then her project would succeed. And if it succeeded, everything would change. Cyrus Dunlap increased his pressure on her. He went to the town council and proposed that Nettie's excavation was a public hazard, a large hole that could collapse at any moment, endangering anyone nearby. He suggested that she be prohibited from continuing the work unless she could post a bond proving she could pay for any damages. It was a deliberate attempt to price her out of her own project, to force her to abandon the well before it could threaten his monopoly. But Nettie's parents, hearing of her struggle through letters, sent money from their homestead 100 miles away. The funds arrived slowly in small envelopes, with letters of encouragement written by her mother. Ezra Whitmore contributed funds from his own savings. Even Reverend Mitchell, who had initially condemned her work as unseemly, came to her quietly at dusk and offered financial assistance. His son had nearly died of heat stroke that summer. Watching Nettie work, watching her refuse to be intimidated, had shown him something about human dignity and determination that his theology had not quite captured. The town was divided. Some saw Nettie as a visionary. Others saw her as an abomination. Most existed in the complicated middle, unsure what to make of a woman who defied both her grief and the town's judgment. By Christmas of 1884, Nettie had reached 200 feet. She had been digging for 6.5 months. Her hands were calloused beyond recognition. Her body was lean and muscular. Her sun-browned skin bore the permanent tan of someone who had spent every daylight hour in the heat. Her straw hat was so worn it barely held its shape, and she had tied it on with twine because the brim was separating. But she had reached the depth she believed would matter. 200 feet beneath the parched surface of Drybone Flats, she widened the chamber and felt cold water flowing. Real water. Flowing water. The kind of water that lived in the earth's deep places, where the sun's heat could never reach, where the drought's cruelty had no power. She built a chamber at that depth, stone lining carved by her own hands, reinforced walls carved from the surrounding rock using techniques she had invented to work more efficiently, and a hand-cranked pulley system that would allow water to be drawn up the long shaft to the surface above. She had spent 14 months digging. Now she tested the system for the first time, her hands shaking slightly with the magnitude of the moment. And water flowed, cold, clear, undeniable. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was mild. The spring came early and wet. And then summer arrived again, and Drybone Flats entered a period of unprecedented drought. It had not rained substantially in 9 months. The prairie was golden brown and brittle. The grass, which should have been green in summer, was the color of old straw. The river that ran through the territory, which had been shrinking steadily, suddenly stopped flowing. One day it was a trickle. The next day it was dry stone and cracked mud from one bank to the other. Cyrus Dunlap's shallow wells began to fail. One by one, throughout the summer of 1885, his wells either ran dry or the water became so brackish it was unusable. His livestock began to die, standing in the fields and dropping where they stood. Ranches dependent on his water supply began to fail. Their owners abandoned the territory, moving east in search of water and stability. He ran to the town council and demanded that something be done. He demanded that the council investigate Nettie's well. Perhaps, he suggested, she had somehow tapped into the underground water and disrupted the natural flow that sustained his operations. It was absurd, scientifically impossible. But Cyrus had power in Drybone Flats, and fear is a powerful amplifier. When people are desperate and things are failing, they will believe almost any explanation. The council agreed to investigate. They sent men to Nettie's property, and what they found was the most remarkable thing anyone in the territory had ever witnessed. 200 feet down, in a stone chamber lit by lantern light, clear cold water flowed, not a trickle, not a seep. Water that moved with purpose, cold enough to raise goosebumps on the skin, pure enough that a person could drink deeply and feel restored immediately. Nettie stood at the top of the shaft, her hand on the pulley system, and demonstrated how the mechanism worked. She brought up bucket after bucket of water. She offered it to the investigating council members. They drank, and several of them wept. The water was impossible. It was everything Nettie had sworn it would be. And it meant that everything Cyrus Dunlap had built his empire on, his monopoly on surface water, was irrelevant. The deep aquifer did not care about his wells. It did not care about his monopoly. It flowed independent of his power. One man had tapped into an aquifer that would never run dry. But it was a woman which somehow made it worse for Cyrus. A widow he had tried to intimidate, whose work he had ridiculed, whose vision he had called madness, had proven him wrong in the most public way possible. The Great Drought of 1886 began in June and worsened through July and August until it became a biblical catastrophe. By August, the temperature had reached 120 degrees. Livestock died standing in the fields. Crops that had survived the dry spring withered to ash in a matter of days. The riverbed, already dry, cracked under the relentless heat into geometric patterns that resembled the surface of a dead planet. Dust storms rose up and turned the sky brown at midday. People covered their faces with bandanas and could barely see 10 feet ahead. Cyrus Dunlap's remaining shallow wells dried up completely. The water they had cached in barrels in his storage buildings began to run low, and he rationed it jealously among his remaining ranch hands. Other ranches in the area, dependent on his water supply or their own failed wells, began to face a crisis. Livestock died, crops failed, people became desperate. By late August, people were dying. An elderly man died of heat stroke and dehydration. A child died of cholera brought on by drinking contaminated water from a stagnant pool. 2 more people died of heat exhaustion and lack of water. A woman died of kidney failure brought on by chronic dehydration. The town was facing something between disaster and apocalypse. A community was literally dying from thirst while surrounded by an ocean of dry earth. And then, quietly, people began to appear at Nettie's property. They came with buckets and containers. They came with their families. They came with their dying and their desperate. They stood in the brutal heat and waited their turn to draw water from the well 200 feet beneath the earth. Nettie worked the pulley system from sunrise until long after sunset. Her hands, already calloused beyond the point of pain, gripped the rope. She hauled bucket after bucket of cold water up from the deep chamber where it flowed endlessly and unfailingly. People drank. People filled containers. People took water back to their families and livestock. Nobody had to beg. Nobody had to grovel. Nettie simply worked and provided, day after day, week after week. Through August and into September, while the heat continued to punish the surface world, and Cyrus Dunlap raged helplessly at the injustice that a woman had become the arbiter of water, and therefore the arbiter of who lived and who died. Cyrus came to the well one afternoon in early September. He stood at the top of the shaft and called down to Nettie. He asked her directly, what would she charge for water? What was her price? Nettie did not stop working. She said, flatly and without any inflection, that water was free, that he could draw as much as he wanted, as many times as he wanted, but he would not pay her. She said that in a drought, water was not a commodity, it was life, and life was not for sale. Cyrus left. He came back that evening and asked again. Again she told him it was free. He came back the next morning, and the next. For weeks, Cyrus Dunlap came to the well daily, and each time Nettie gave him water, for free, to the man who had tried to destroy her, who had attempted to have her committed to an asylum, who had tried to bankrupt her. She gave water as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She treated him exactly as she treated everyone else. with the same calm efficiency, with the same refusal to charge, with the same implicit acknowledgement that his money and his power meant nothing in a drought, and that the only thing that mattered was water, which she had in abundance, and he did not. By September, the drought had begun to break slightly. Rain came, not enough to restore the prairie, but enough to ease the relentless heat. The temperature dropped from 120 to 100, and people began to breathe more easily. Slowly, the crisis passed. Slowly, people began to resume normal operations. The river, though still low, began to flow again. Shallow wells began to produce water again. Life in Drybone Flats returned to something resembling stability. And then, in late September, the town council met formally to address the crisis and its resolution. They voted unanimously to recognize Nettie Colquhoun's well as a permanent public water source. They granted her a stipend for maintaining the system. They offered her a place of honor in the town. They proposed that her story be remembered and that her well be considered one of the great achievements in the history of the Kansas Territory. Cyrus Dunlap sat in that meeting and said nothing. His empire, built on controlling shallow water in a dry land, had been utterly destroyed by one woman and a hole 200 feet deep. He had tried to intimidate her, to make her seem foolish, to price her out of her own project, to marginalize her through the weight of community judgment, and she had simply continued working. She had dug down into the earth and found something that made everything he had built irrelevant. The frontier never forgave the proud, but it always sheltered the prepared. And sometimes the person everyone calls foolish is the only one hearing what the frontier whispers. Even in summer, when the heat tries to drown out all other voices, the earth is always speaking to those patient enough to listen, to those brave enough to dig deeper, to those willing to work alone, if that is what survival demands. Subscribe to Winter Whispers for more stories of frontier wisdom and quiet survival.